of Israel from about 539 BC to 332 BC. And the Bible tells us about the return from captivity, the reconstruction period as they're rebuilding after they have been taken into exile by the Babylonians. The Babylonians conquered, but then the Medo-Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians, and they took over Babylon as their capital city. King Cyrus of Persia issued an edict, and he was allowing any Jew who wanted to return back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and reestablish worship. This period of 100-something years, the primary leaders in this period were Zerubbabel, who was actually a Davidic descendant. He was established as governor, so there was a lot of hope that the Davidic lineage would be reestablished. And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah talk about Zerubbabel and the hopes of the Davidic lineage being reestablished. And there is a high priest by the name of Joshua. And the Haggai and Zechariah talk about both of these figures. Also, we have other people in not in the very initial stage, but in when the reconstruction of the temple begins and is almost immediately halted, and they spend a couple of decades just not doing anything, and then they take it back up. And when they restart building, Ezra and Nehemiah are two other significant figures in this period. Ezra is a scribe, and his area of expertise is the law of Moses, and he takes it upon himself to lead the people to recommit themselves to the covenant of the law, and establishes a systematic approach to teaching people the law and interpreting the law for them. And from Ezra's efforts eventually comes the whole synagogue system throughout Jewish life. Anywhere there are Jews spread throughout the world, they'll put together a synagogue and share with them the teachings of the rabbis, the interpretations that have been handed down. This all begins with Ezra. Another significant leader is Nehemiah. He came back and led some religious reform when people were starting to again intermingle with pagan cultures around them. And he helped finish securing the city of Jerusalem by rebuilding the wall around it. This period of under the Persians also leads to the beginning of a hard divide between the returned Jews who are rebuilding and what eventually in the New Testament era will become the Samaritans. Samaria was a major city in the northern territory, north of Judah. When the Jews returned to rebuild Jerusalem and Judea under the Persians, the seat of government for that whole region that they called the region beyond the river was Samaria. So while the Jews are trying to rebuild, the real center of power in that whole region is in Samaria, not in Jerusalem. And we know the story from the book of Ezra, that they start to rebuild the temple, and immediately the people in the north come down and say, we worship Yahweh too. We've been worshiping Yahweh since Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king, brought us here. So clearly they're not Jews themselves. They are people that the Assyrians brought in from other countries, and they have intermingled with the few Israelites that the Assyrians left behind. And they've started worshiping Yahweh, but Yahweh as one more God among other gods. So clearly their approach to worshiping Yahweh is tainted. And the response of the people who are trying to rebuild the temple is, you have nothing to do with Yahweh. You have no part in this project. So they turn them down in no uncertain terms. And that leads to them using all of their political might and influence to try to frustrate their attempt to rebuild the temple. So they become enemies, basically, and they send letters to Babylon, to the king, to the king of Persia, and try to halt the work and oppose it throughout the whole period. But that is the beginning of a big divide between the people in the north and the people in Judah the territory of Judah. This continues all the way into the New Testament, so that by the time we get to the New Testament, the Jewish people won't even sit at a table with a Samaritan. The rabbis are teaching that a Samaritan woman is impure from the moment of birth, as though she were in her menstrual period. Which, according to the law of Moses, made her impure. Anybody who sat next to her became impure. So it was like a Samaritan woman was impure from birth to grave. You couldn't even touch them. You couldn't come anywhere near them. That kind of enmity. Eventually, in this intertestamental period, the Samaritans will build their own competing temple on Mount Gerizim. But one of the Jewish leaders will tear it down. But when the Samaritan woman is talking to Jesus, she says, our ancestors worshipped here on this Mount Gerizim. And she points to these, or references these ruins that have not too long ago been destroyed by some Jewish people. But that's kind of the origin of this rivalry. It goes back several hundred years, 500 years. Another thing that's interesting in the Persian period is that the high priest becomes a political post. The Persians did not want to put a Davidic governor in place. Zerubbabel is there for a bit, and he kind of disappears from the record. And there are no more Davidic governors. The Persians seem to recognize that the hopes of the Davidic king are very large, and they're worried about sedition. So they turn the high priest into the highest ranking official, the highest representative, which means that from this point forward, the high priest is not simply somebody who leads worship and teaches the law of Moses. He is a political figure, and that change happens under the Persians. But the Persians eventually are conquered by the Greeks. We go next, after the Persian period, we go into the Alexandrian period. And this takes us from 332 to 301 BC. And the whole Alexandrian period, the whole Greek or Hellenic, if you're reading and you come across Hellenism, we're talking about Greek culture. You might have noticed in sports, the Greeks today, their shirt will say Hellenas, because that's another way to say that. That's the ancient way of saying Greek. So anyway, Alexander himself was actually not Greek. He was Macedonian, which is just north of Greece. But after the Battle of Issus, Darius III of Persia retreated to the east. And Alexander, the Macedonian king, secured all of Syria, the land of Canaan, Egypt, and then he redoubled his focus further east on Persia. He followed in the footsteps of his father, Philip of Macedonia. He had been a warrior, and another huge influence in Alexander the Great's life was his tutor, Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher. And Aristotle shaped Alexander's mind and convinced him that Greek culture and thought was the most elevated form of human living that there could be. So Alexander went out fighting his wars with this vision of let's unify the whole world with the best culture there is, the Greek culture. Everywhere he went, and he did defeat the Persians. But when he went on his military campaigns, he was accompanied by philosophers and scientists. Anywhere he conquered, he basically went into the city he had conquered and put into it, in the center of the city, kind of the bare bones of what constituted the basic things that every Greek city had to have. He built a hippodrome, which is a horse racetrack. He built a gymnasium where men could exercise and exercise the body. And he built a place of teaching where people could exercise the mind. And in this way, he left behind in all the cities he conquered the core institutions or core spaces where Greek thought and life could be shared. He encouraged his warriors to settle in the conquered cities, to marry local women and settle there, and he would give them land in the conquered cities. So by doing this, Alexander basically established Greek culture and thought throughout the ancient world. And he made a great effort to join the East and the West. When he conquered the Persian Empire, he took Persians and put them in high-ranking positions within his empire. One of the most important elements of Hellenic culture is that Koine Greek, common Greek, also known as Koine, Koine, this became the universal language across the whole ancient Near East, and not just the Near East, even in the West. For a period of about 600 years, the entire world, from the Middle East to Europe, could communicate in Greek. It's not coincidence that Jesus came about right in the middle of that 600-year period. Right at the height of when Greek was being used across all these countries, which meant that the first missionaries, the first disciples, were able to go and share the gospel without having to learn language. Everybody could communicate in Greek, so they were able to use Greek, and the gospel spread incredibly because God had allowed this groundwork to be laid by Alexander the Great. Paul, because of that, was able to minister in Arabia, in Israel, in Asia Minor, in Macedonia, in Greece, and in Italy without having to learn a language. So let's talk about Israel under Alexander the Great. The land of Israel, if you look at the map, is a strategic little strip of land. It really is small, a little over 100 miles wide, and just a few hundred miles north to south. But it's the only way you could get armies from the whole northern Fertile Crescent area down to the whole huge area around the Nile in Egypt. Those were the big empires in the ancient world. Egypt was a huge empire, and then all the other huge empires were coming up in the northern Fertile Crescent area. Syria, then Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then Greece. All of those are up in the north, and all of them want to conquer Egypt. And when Egypt is the dominant power, they want to spread north and conquer further north. So that everybody has to go through this little bitty strip of land that's in the middle, and that's the land of Canaan, the land where Israel was. So under Alexander the Great, obviously he recognized the importance of this strategic piece of land. Given the Mediterranean Sea on the west, the impassable Arabian Desert on the right, on the east, that's the only way to march troops down to Egypt. Now Alexander was in control, but he did not try to implement his religion anywhere he conquered. He let the locals worship whoever they wanted to worship, and he did not demand that people worship him as a god. So that meant that while he was in charge of things, people in the land of Judah were okay with it. He didn't really interfere much. But we all know Alexander died young. He was in his early 30s when he died. And a long fight ensued between his generals. So who were the successors of Alexander the Great? They fought for control, and finally 4 of his generals managed to come out on top. And they got together and made an agreement that they would divvy up the vast empire that Alexander had accumulated, and they would divide it in 4 amongst themselves. The 2 that affect life in Israel are Seleucus, who controlled the area of Syria just north of Israel, and kind of that area of Babylon and all the Fertile Crescent area. And in the south, Ptolemy. He controlled Egypt, and initially he was in control of the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. So initially, after Alexander died, the people of Israel were under the control of the Ptolemies. That's Ptolemy, Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy was the general of Alexander who took this portion of his empire. He chose the city of Alexandria as his capital city. This city was a city that Alexander the Great had founded on the river Nile Delta, so right there on the Mediterranean, in the delta of the Nile River. And he chose that as his capital. It's important to understand that the Ptolemies were Greeks. So they were not Egyptian. They were not African in their culture or background. They were Greeks. And what they established in Alexandria was very much a Greek-thinking city. The city grew quickly, and it became a center of Greek culture that was highly respected for commerce and especially learning. Ptolemy I, who was sometimes called Soter, S-O-T-E-R, he established the great library of Alexandria that stood for almost 1,000 years. And this was a treasure trove of knowledge in the ancient world. Up until this time, the Jewish people had had very little contact with Greeks. But now Jews went to Egypt in large numbers, and they learned Greek. They learned to appreciate Greek literature. At this time, the land of Israel was also undergoing a process of Hellenization, in other words, being affected by Greek culture. And Jews were exposed to the attraction of the Greek lifestyle, the language, the art, enjoying its festivals and games and sports and that kind of thing. People frequented amphitheaters and public baths. As long as there was no attempt to attack the Jewish religion, the process of Hellenization just continued without opposition. But this didn't last because the Seleucids, who were north, wanted this piece of land. So eventually the Seleucids take over. And this was Seleucus was the other general that succeeded Alexander. He pushed south. They pushed south eventually. The period when they were under Ptolemaic control was 301 to 198 BC. But in 198, the Syrians are able to gain control of Canaan. The Battle of Panias took place in 198 BC. That's P-A-N-I-A-S, Panias. And in that battle, Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, defeated Ptolemy V of Egypt. Not long after this, Antiochus himself was defeated by the Romans, and they forced him to pay a heavy tribute. And when his successor, Antiochus IV, was reigning, he attempted to plunder the treasury of the Jerusalem temple to pay those tributes to Rome. So at this time, the Romans are rising in power, and they're exerting their influence. And then we get to his son, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and this is when all the major stuff happens. The crisis comes under the rule of Antiochus IV. He gave himself the name Epiphanes, which means the illustrious one. So he called himself, he thought he was pretty amazing. And his desire was to rule over a completely Greek Hellenized state. And even in matters of religion, he did not have the kind of gracious Persian and Alexandrian attitude toward other religions. He wanted everybody to toe the line. He announced his own divinity on his coins. Those coins bore the inscription, "From King Antiochus, manifest God, bearer of victory." So while he's in charge, several things happen in Jerusalem. Let's start talking with Jason, Onias III, Onias IV, and Menelaus. There's a big power struggle going on in Jerusalem because the legitimate high priest at this moment was Onias III. But he had a brother by the name of Jason who wanted to be high priest. So he went to Antiochus IV and said, "Let me buy the high priesthood from you." And he offered him a bunch of money. And Antiochus IV said, "That sounds great. Why don't you be high priest?" So he took the money and established Jason as the official high priest. Now, Jason was on board with this Hellenistic program of Antiochus. He was all on board with Greek festivals and sporting events, and they had a Greek gymnasium built in Jerusalem, which was shocking to the Jewish people because they exercised in the nude. And young men were being trained in the Greek lifestyle. And of course, because of exercising in the nude, there were some who were reluctant to go through with circumcision because they didn't want to be stigmatized. It was kind of moving into this fully Hellenized culture. Now, the son of Onias IV, he just left and he went to Egypt. And in southern Egypt, in the city of Leontopolis, he built a rival temple with kind of a syncretic, kind of paganized cult. But this rival temple was being used until the Romans destroyed it when they put down the Jewish rebellion in AD 72. So that rival temple was there all the way until AD 72. But let's go back to the time we're talking about. In 172 BC, a guy by the name of Menelaus offered Antiochus IV more money than Jason for the high priesthood. He said, "Hey, I can outbid Jason." So he did. And of course, Antiochus didn't care. Money's money, and it spends just as well. So he took Menelaus' money and made Menelaus the high priest. Now, the difference now is Menelaus was not a Levite. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. So this is the first time that somebody who, according to the law of Moses, could not legitimately be high priest was made high priest. He was not of the tribe of Levi. In fact, the law of Moses specifies not only that it had to be a Levite, but it had to be from the family of Aaron to be high priest. Well, Menelaus is none of those things. But the secularization of the position of high priest is basically set from this point. Which leads to having two Jewish groups in dispute. There's an internal struggle going on among the Jews. And up until this point, the conflict in Judah has been between Jews. There's a pro-Hellenic group who likes Greek thought and culture and says, we can still be good Jews and embrace some of these things. And others who do not want anything to do with Greek culture, leave us alone, we're doing just fine, let's keep to our traditions. Now, when Antiochus Epiphanes begins to put the pressure on for Hellenism, the pro-Hellenic group becomes more aggressive. And they know they've got the backing of Antiochus IV. They pressure everybody else to accept the Greek lifestyle. Those who opposed Hellenization called themselves the Hasidim. Today we talk about Hasidic Jews. The Hasidim, which means the pious, these were the predecessors of the Pharisees, the Hasidim. So they wanted to defend Jewish religion and customs. They wanted to stop the rising tide of apostasy. And these, at this time, the pro-Hellenists were enjoying their position of privilege, and they were very quick to dismiss their Jewish heritage. They were trying to raise the political position of Jerusalem on the world stage. and saw this as an opportunity to do that. And then they could get wealth and power for themselves. But Antiochus IV does something that changes the whole situation, and it becomes not just a difference of opinion between Jews, it becomes open revolt against Antiochus. It happens when Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, is in Egypt. Jason and Menelaus are fighting for the high priesthood. They're battling over who gets to be high priest. And there's a conflict that breaks out in Jerusalem between these two factions. And when Antiochus hears of it, he rushes back to Jerusalem, and he thinks it's rebellion against him, so he just crushes both sides and kills a bunch of people. Well, that focuses negative sentiment not on each other but on Antiochus. People now have a reason to not like Antiochus. Not long after this, Antiochus IV is in Egypt again, and he's on the verge of victory. He is finally going to put the Ptolemies out for good, and he is finally going to take control of Egypt, and he can taste it. When a Roman envoy shows up and says, "Back off, or you're going to have to deal with us." So he has basically victory snatched from him at the last moment by the Romans. And he knows he can't face the Romans. So he goes back home to Syria, north of Israel. Of course, he has to go through Israel. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, a mistaken report arrived that Antiochus had been killed in battle. So the whole city throws a big party to celebrate the death of Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's when he comes through town. So that's it. That he says, "I'm done." He's already upset, and this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. So he says, "I'm done tiptoeing around this." So he basically outlaws Judaism. He goes into the Jerusalem temple. He takes all the money. He takes all the sacred stuff. He builds a pagan altar on top of the bronze altar and sacrifices a pig on it to desecrate the altar. And he forbids the practice of circumcision, the observance of Sabbath, and orders that all copies of the scriptures be destroyed. So, from this point forward, it's not Jews against Jews. It's Jews against Antiochus. This leads to the Maccabean or Hasmonean period. And this is where maybe that family tree will help you keep things straight. Maccabean or Hasmonean refers to the same dynasty. I want to say it was the grandfather of Mattathias was Hasmon. So sometimes the dynasty is referred to as the Hasmonean dynasty. Anyway, but it all starts with Mattathias. Antiochus IV's brutal reaction led many to abandon Judaism, abandon the faith, and many resisted and were killed. Many resisted and were killed. Now, one priest by the name of Mattathias, he went from Jerusalem to Modin, M-O-D-E-I-N. Went from Jerusalem to Modin. But when he got to Modin, he found that the same situation was going on there. There was a Greek representative who showed up, and he commanded Mattathias as acting priest to guide the pagan cult. And Mattathias said, "I will not do that." So some young guy stepped up and said, "Oh, well, I'll do it." And Mattathias got up and killed that young guy and the Greek representative who had come to give these instructions. And then he grabbed his sons and he ran to the hillsides. And thus began the Maccabean revolt. Thus began the Hasmonean revolt. Mattathias had 3 sons who were important leaders in this period of revolt against the Seleucids, against Antiochus. Revolution broke out. Now, initially, the Jews could only fight guerrilla style. They could only choose targets, kind of jump out of hiding, attack something, and then run away and hide again. They couldn't take the battlefield. They didn't have the numbers. They didn't have the weapons. They just couldn't do open warfare. But And in the beginning, the enemies would gather up and attack them on Saturday because they couldn't do anything on Saturday. And they were getting massacred until Mattathias told them, guys, if we don't start fighting on Saturday, there's not going to be anybody left to observe Sabbath. So they said, okay, we'll fight on Saturday if we have to. Now, eventually Mattathias dies, and he is succeeded by his son Judas, who has the nickname Maccabeus. And this means the hammer. That's a great nickname, isn't it? Judas the Hammer. And he was given that name because he was a very bold and able leader and had a lot of success in his attacks and his fighting. So that's why the name Maccabean has been given to the whole dynasty, because of Judas the Hammer, Judas Maccabeus. Hasmon was Mattathias' great-grandfather. That's why sometimes people call it the Hasmonean dynasty. Little by little, the Jews became strong enough to move from guerrilla fighting to actually taking the battlefield. And they were finally able to retake Jerusalem, with the exception of the citadel, which remained a Syrian garrison. But they purified the temple, they rededicated it on December 25th of 165, or perhaps 164 BC, an event that was still being commemorated in Jesus' day. If you look at John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, they talk about this. And Jews still today observe it. You know what we're talking about? What Jews observe on December 25th? Hanukkah. Right, the Festival of Lights, yeah. So it goes back to the Maccabean period, when they were able to retake Jerusalem and rededicate the temple after Antiochus IV had profaned it. There were internal rivalries in Syria that weakened this effort against the Jews. So Antiochus IV's general, his name was Lysias, Lysias, Lysias. He said, you know what, I can't fight in the north and the south. So he gave up. He said, I'll grant you religious liberty, and I've got to focus my fighting efforts further north. This was the goal that the Hasidim, the precursors of the Pharisees, this was what they had been wanting. They just wanted to be able to practice Jewish religion without oppression or opposition. So they gave up the fight. They were done fighting. That's all they needed. Of course, Judas Maccabee was not content with that. He wanted full independence. He wanted for them to do their own thing and have nobody calling any shots for them. So they kept on fighting without the help of the Hasidim. So if this is the group from which the Pharisees came, you can see that this is the branch that is less favorably connected politically in terms of those who end up being in power, because they chose not to continue the fight. But anyway, eventually Judas Maccabeus appeals to Rome, and he enters into an agreement with them. And Rome sent orders to Syria to leave Judah alone, but the orders arrived too late. By the time the orders arrived, Judas had died in battle at Elasa, Elasa. But his brothers took up the torch. Even with the death of Judas Maccabeus, Syria was not able to destroy the resistance. They had internal weaknesses, the external threats of Rome, and Judas was followed by his brother Jonathan. Jonathan continued to lead the effort for independence, and in 152 BC, he became high priest. And then when he died, the succession went to his brother Simon. So these three brothers led during this period. And so Simon followed after Jonathan died. And in 142, they finally gained political independence, 142 BC. This lasted more or less about 80 years. For the moment, Rome recognized Judah as independent. They would not interfere in their affairs. And Simon was declared high priest, commander of the Jewish armed forces, and king. For the first time in Jewish history, one person held all titles of leadership: religious, military, and civil. When Simon died, he was succeeded by his son, John Hyrcanus. And there were problems at this time. The Jewish people said, well, our safety and independence should be based on what God is doing, not on some kind of an alliance or an arrangement with Rome. And now that they had power to create their own laws, those who had been resisting the influence of Greek culture and Hellenism, now they're the guys in charge, right? They've been fighting against the Romans, and not the Romans, against the Syrians and the Seleucid dynasty. They've been fighting against Antiochus and his forces, and they just want to be Jews. And so now that Antiochus isn't in charge promoting Hellenism, the people who are now in charge kind of return the favor and mistreat those who had been pro-Hellenists. They treat them severely and basically alienate them from the cause of the victors. They imposed Judaism by force, even, this is the great irony, even on people who were not Jews. They used mercenary troops to impose the Jewish lifestyle and observance of the law of Moses, even in areas of Samaria or Idumea, which is ancient Edom. They basically imposed Judaism. So they kind of did the same thing to others that they were complaining about having been done to them. When John Hyrcanus died in 105 BC, his son Aristobulus I ruled. He only ruled 1 year. But during this time, a group emerges that was a minority, but they were extremely influential. It was made up almost exclusively of members of the aristocracy. From this group developed what we call the Sadducees. These were the politically connected folks, powerful, wealthy, and their view of Hellenism was, Hellenism's not that bad. As long as we don't have to stop observing the law of Moses, there are things in Hellenistic life that we can embrace without failing to keep the law. So they were favorable towards Hellenism, and they thought you could be that way without abandoning your Jewish roots. And a strong antagonism developed between this new group and the Pharisees that are coming out of the Hasidim. These two groups are kind of at each other's throats. So Aristobulus I was a Sadducee. But when he died, I said he only reigned a year. When he died, for a while there, his wife was in charge. Her name was I'm confusing things. Scratch that. Aristobulus I was a Sadducee. When he died, he was succeeded by Alexander Jannaeus, who was also a Sadducee. And he was really rough on the Pharisees. He mistreated the Pharisees. And he ruled until he died in 78 BC. And this is the one who, when he died, was succeeded by his wife, Salome Alexandra, who happened to be a bred-in-the-bone Pharisee. So her husband was a Sadducee, but she was a Pharisee. So when he dies and she takes over, she wants, and here's the the really complicated thing. She had two kids, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Hyrcanus II must have been a mama's boy because he was a Pharisee. And Aristobulus II must have been his dad's boy, because he was a Sadducee. So her two sons, one was a Sadducee, one was a Pharisee. She said, well, let's all get along. Let's make peace. Let's bring things together. What I'll do is I will make Hyrcanus II high priest. And he's the Pharisee. He's the religious type. So I'll make him high priest. And I'll tell Aristobulus II to be commander of the army. Her idea did not work, because immediately they started trying to figure out who gets to be in charge of all of it. They started fighting amongst themselves. Hyrcanus II, the Pharisee, the high priest, he was supported by Antipater. This guy was an Idumean military advisor. Now, the Idumeans are in the area of what used to be Edom, to the south of Israel. And he had counseled his father, Alexander Jannaeus. He was also supported by Aretas, king of Nabatea. But guess what Aristobulus II had that Hyrcanus didn't have? He had an army. He was commander of the army. So they fought for 6 years. Neither side got the upper hand. This leads us to the Roman period. It goes from 63 BC onward through this period we're talking about. So you might wonder, how in the world, if the Maccabees, the Jews, were in charge, how is it that somebody like Herod ends up in charge? He's not a Jew. Well, here's the story. How does Herod rise to power? It all starts with Pompey. Rome had already been spreading out in Egypt and Asia Minor. It had even reached the land of Syria. And in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria. And while he does all this, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II are duking it out in Jerusalem. So he stops there north, and he's waiting to see what's going to happen. How's this going to play out before I step in? So Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II go up to Damascus to meet with Pompey. And each of them is looking for him to make, for Rome to make him the official guy in charge. They're embarrassed when they get there to meet with Pompey and find out that the Jews have sent a third delegation asking for neither of them to be in charge. Pompey looks this all over, and in the end, he chooses Hyrcanus II. When Pompey gets to Jerusalem, people are not happy to see Roman troops in the city. When he approaches the temple area, there's an opposition group who doesn't want him to go into the temple, so he takes the Temple Mount by force and slaughters a bunch of people, and he makes the point that he can go wherever he wants. He goes into the temple, he manhandles all the sacred objects, and takes it over. He imposes a heavy tribute on Judah. He frees a lot of the cities that the Maccabees had taken over, where they had been imposing the Jewish lifestyle. And he put them under the control of this newly conquered province of Syria. He proclaimed Hyrcanus II high priest, but Jewish independence was over. Now they answered to the Roman Empire. Aristobulus II was sent back to Rome. Pompey named Antipater of Idumea counselor to Hyrcanus II. And Antipater was a great defender of Pompey. He came to have great influence in the region. He was politically savvy, and he was able to curry the favor of these powerful Roman figures. Which leads us to the first triumvirate, Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. These three guys divided up power in the Roman Empire. Crassus would take over Italy, Pompey would be in charge of Syria, Julius Caesar would be in charge of Gaul. But this triumvirate arrangement is dissolving when Crassus dies in battle in 53 BC. Who gets to take over Italy? Well, Julius Caesar feels like he's closer than Pompey. He's in Gaul, and the famous moment of decision. He's at the Rubicon River. Do I cross the river and go take Rome? And eventually he does, and that becomes the referent for kind of a moment where you've crossed the line and there's no going back. He goes in, he conquers the city of Rome and takes over. So to complicate things for Pompey, he releases Aristobulus II and sends him back just to cause trouble in Jerusalem. Of course, they catch him and kill him. He doesn't actually cause much trouble, but that's just kind of let me see how much trouble I can cause Pompey. So after a defeat in 48 BC, Pompey makes the unfortunate decision to take refuge with Ptolemy the 13th of Egypt. Remember the Ptolemies in northern Egypt? They're still around. And we are now at Ptolemy the 13th, who happens to be 13 years old at this moment. And he's kind of a protege of Pompey. Pompey is fleeing from Julius Caesar. He sails across the Mediterranean, arrives in Alexandria, and much to his surprise, the young Ptolemy the 13th has his troops kill him the moment he gets off the boat. So Pompey's dead. Meanwhile, Julius is on a boat chasing him. Julius Caesar is hot on his tail. So he's sailing there, and when he arrives... Now, by the way, at this time, Ptolemy the 13th had taken as his wife his sister, his older sister, Cleopatra the 7th. That was a practice of the Ptolemies. They did sibling marriages, which isn't a great thing for strong lineage, but this is the famous Cleopatra of movies. This is the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra. Cleopatra the 7th. So he had married her, and they were co-regents, but he got upset with her. Who knows? She was 21, he was 13, and he dismissed her. So they had a dust up of some sort. But this is when Julius Caesar arrives. And of course, Julius Caesar, he doesn't have his whole army, but he's brought troops to deal with Pompey. So he is able to take over the palace and put Ptolemy the 13th in prison and hooks up with Cleopatra. And they actually have a son, though he doesn't become a politically important figure. But anyway, he takes up with Cleopatra and imprisons Ptolemy the 13th, but he underestimated just how much local support this Ptolemy the 13th had, because the Egyptians surround the palace, and Julius Caesar finds himself in a desperate situation because his army is on the other side of the Mediterranean. There's no way to get them there in time to bail him out. He is surrounded. So he says, what can I do to help things? Well, he releases Ptolemy the 13th, thinking that will appease them. And all the kid does is take charge of the army, and it makes matters worse. So he's holed up in the palace there, surrounded. And this is where Antipater steps into the story. Remember that Pompey had made Antipater the military advisor to Hyrcanus II, the high priest. So Caesar is sending messengers desperately trying to get his troops, but they're too far away. And Antipater in Jerusalem hears of this. And he knows there is a significant Jewish population in Alexandria. And so he uses all of his political connections and weight to influence his Syrian neighbors, put together some Jewish mercenary troops, and pressure the Jewish sector in Alexandria to help Julius Caesar out of this tight spot. Sometimes we don't realize how easily our history could be very different If Antipater had not stepped in, and Julius Caesar's story might have ended there. But he steps in, and they are able to rescue Julius Caesar, and he lives to fight another day. So as thanks to Antipater, Julius Caesar makes some important changes in Judah. He names the high priest Hyrcanus II ethnarch, which makes him a political figure. Now, the Romans had so many titles for so many levels of governance and power, but basically he adds political, not just religious, weight to the title of high priest. He makes him ethnarch. He lightens the tribute. He returns some of their territories. He exempts them from military service because of their Sabbath observance. So the Jews are the only people in the Roman Empire who are allowed to not have to be drafted into the Roman army. And they are granted the freedom to practice their religion, even to pay offerings to their temple. Julius Caesar raised the rank of Antipater of Idumea. He granted him Roman citizenship, which is a hugely important thing. It wasn't tied to the Roman state, it was tied to the city of Rome, and granted you the highest possible level of privileges throughout the Roman Empire. He made him procurator and placed him in charge of Judea. So now he wasn't the advisor to Hyrcanus II. Hyrcanus II now answered to him. So this is how Antipater ends up being in charge. It was hard for the Jews. They had to accept now being governed by these rival people that in centuries past, the Edomites had often, under the kings of Israel, had been a vassal kingdom to the south. And even recently under the Maccabees, they had imposed Jewish life on them by force. Now one of their guys is in charge, an Idumean. So how does Herod the Great end up being in charge? So one of Antipater's sons was named Herod. I say Herod the Great, but that's just what they ended up calling him. He was just called Herod. But eventually he came to be known as Herod the Great. He was placed in charge of Galilee and when he was just a teenager. And he demonstrated such remarkable administrative ability that he earned the praise even of Roman officials. They recognized this guy's pretty solid. And they took his older brother Phasael and placed him in charge of Judea. So he was up north in Galilee, Phasael was south in Judea. Meanwhile, in the Roman Empire, we have the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus. After the death of Julius Caesar, this second triumvirate is formed. And Mark Antony takes over Asia as his sphere of influence. So at this time, we're talking about Antigonus and the Parthians and Herod and Phasael. Jewish nobles tried to get Mark Antony to remove Herod and Phasael from ruling over them. They wanted to be ruled by Jews, not Idumeans, but the request was denied. So then the Jewish nobles backed Antigonus, who was the only child remaining of the deceased Aristobulus II. If you look at your family tree, he was Aristobulus II, son of Salome Alexandra. So Antigonus is the last remaining Maccabee. They asked for help from the Parthians, who were further east, and they came to Jerusalem with the Parthians, and they demanded a sit-down with the sons of Antipater. So they said Herod and Phasael, and they asked for Hyrcanus II to join them too. In other words, they wanted to sit down with everybody who had any possible claim to being in charge. In all of this, Herod smelled a trap. So Herod didn't go to this meeting. He fled to Rome. He ran off to Rome. And when he got to Rome, he curried the favor of Mark Antony and Octavius and the Roman Senate, and the Senate named him King of Judea. Of course, at this point, it was in name only, but officially the Romans named Herod King of Judea. Now, meanwhile, the Parthians took control of that whole region from 40 to 39 BC, a year or two there. They surrounded Phasael there in Jerusalem, and he committed suicide. So Phasael died. Herod is off in Rome and is officially the king of Judea. Meanwhile, Herod is able to arrange to marry Mariamne, a very beautiful woman, and she was a granddaughter of Aristobulus II by her father Alexander, and also of Hyrcanus II by her mother Alexandra, which tied Herod to the Maccabees both ways. He was able, with the help of Rome, to take Jerusalem back and kill Antigonus. So Antigonus had been supported by the Sadducees, so Herod appealed to the Pharisees instead. And he was able to win their favor. He was really skilled in keeping the right people happy, not offending their religious beliefs, but at the same time demonstrating absolute loyalty to Rome. When the second triumvirate was dissolved and Antony and Octavius faced off, this put Herod in a bad position. Remember that Cleopatra VII, who had been with her brother and then with Julius Caesar? Well, now she's with Mark Antony. Same Cleopatra. And he seems to be just absolutely smitten with her. And she's working her magic on him and convincing him to give her more and more of Herod's territories. She's chipping away at the southern areas of Judea, trying to extend her control further north from Egypt. And Antony, of course, is giving her everything she wants. So that puts a strain on his relationship with Herod, Antony and Herod. But even so, Herod was willing to support him when he's facing off against Octavius. The only reason he was not allowed to fight alongside Antony is that Cleopatra didn't allow it. She didn't like him. So she told Mark Antony, don't let this guy fight with us. So, as it turns out, Antony lost. He died. Octavius won in 27 BC, and he adopted for himself the name Augustus. Caesar Augustus. So Herod finds himself on the losing side of this, right? He was supportive of Antony, and now Octavius is the guy who's still alive. So he goes up to Octavius and is very candid with him, says, man, I was loyal to Antony, but he's dead. I'm ready to be just as loyal to you. And he convinces Octavius. So that basically cements him with the full Roman support as the official king of that whole region. In his personal life, Herod goes from bad to worse. It seems he loved Mariamne deeply, but he was given a false report that she was unfaithful to him, so he had her killed. When he found out he was wrong, it almost drove him mad. And his health was failing, but he did recover to a certain extent and actually lived to be pretty old given the time period. He lived to be 70 years old. But the rest of his life was marked by suspicion and bloodshed. He had 10 wives, and he basically killed anybody who he felt was a threat to him. And he became more and more paranoid, which means he killed more and more people. He even had his own son Aristobulus put to death in 7 BC. Herod, we talk about him as Herod the Great because he had children who also went by the name Herod, so we distinguish the Herods. Herod the Great was the first Herod. He set out on an ambitious construction plan. In fact, of all the Roman period, he was one of the great builders of the Roman period. Who knew, right? But he invested tremendously in built. He built there wasn't a natural harbor for the whole territory of Israel. So he said, okay, well, I'm going to name this after Caesar. I'm going to call this place Caesarea, and I'm going to build a harbor artificially. And even though it was sandy and it really wasn't it wasn't a natural harbor, he built an artificial harbor where ships could come in at Caesarea Maritima, and gave that whole region a place where ships could come in and go out. Up until him, that didn't happen. The huge project he went into was to remodel the temple. Technically, we describe it as still the second temple, but basically he built this enormous temple around the temple that had been built by the returned exiles, and they dismantled the other temple inside. Now, technically it was a remodel, but really it was a rebuild. And this is the one you see in illustrations, Herod's temple with all the colonnades of Roman columns, and, that's Roman architecture, white marble and, all that's Herod's temple. He rebuilt Samaria, named it Sebasti, which means August, in honor of the title Octavius had chosen for himself. Even so, Herod kept losing more and more the support of the Pharisees and people in general. He became cruel and bitter. The final years of his life were marked by suffering and madness. He had a horrible sickness in his body that he ended up being bedridden and was just rotting away in his bed. He died in 4 BC, about a year or two after Jesus was born, and his cruelty and paranoia is evident in his order to have all the children in Bethlehem killed to try to stamp out Jesus. He's already almost dead, but that's the kind of guy he was. He died unloved by his subjects. Despite many mistakes, though, Herod did provide Judah with a time of peace, and he was able to keep the Roman Empire from coming in to impose their pagan religion and that kind of thing. He was able to protect the religious liberty that the Jews enjoyed. Okay, well, that is basically everything I wanted to cover today. Yes?
What happened to Cleopatra when Octavius killed her?
I am not sure. She is the last of the Ptolemies. And she does have a son of Julius Caesar, but he doesn't end up being anything significant.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Why did they put children in control? You're talking about teenagers and the 13-year-old. Why did they do that?
Because of nepotism. You want your kids in charge. And if it happens that sometimes it's a way for the politicians that surround the royal family to have some control, because it's easier to manipulate a teenager. So sometimes it's in the interest of the aristocracy to keep that going. And they can kind of shape what kind of policies this young person might want to implement. But that goes back to the Old Testament period. I mean, there are kings in the history of Israel that came to the throne at 8 years old, and Josiah. No, is it Josiah that came in when he was 8 years old? Yeah. So it's about keeping the lineage.
So that they were more or less a figurehead.
Yeah, depending on just some kids are just really built for, like Herod was built for command. I mean, he apparently was really quick and able to take charge of things from a very early age. But yeah, some were probably more figureheads. Who knows? Any other questions? Next Saturday, we'll be talking about the rest of the Herods. And we'll go through some just kind of Jewish life in the first century, kind of try to paint a picture for what life was like for Jewish people in the first century. And hopefully this will give us a good background for the New Testament. And then next Sunday, we're beginning our first message in the series where we're stepping into the New Testament. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. We will do this again next Saturday. Appreciate you coming. God bless.